Speaking about Western man and his choices, I should like to begin to speak about the question of choice, which in a way is also the question of freedom. Does anyone have the choice to decide between life and death, peace and war? And to what extent does man have the freedom to make such decision? Man as an individual and we as a Western society. I should like to make a few points which seem to me in need of some clarification. The first point is a good deal of the discussion on freedom is conducted in terms of has man freedom or does man not have freedom? I think this question of freedom or not freedom, as if freedom was a given substance, something which man has or does not have, is only apt to confuse the problem. I would say freedom is not a fixed quality somebody has or doesn't have, but it is a faculty which depends on man's total development, just as wisdom is a faculty which depends on man's development, or in fact our capacity to speak. Let me give you a simple example. If two people play chess, they start out with complete freedom to win. The freedom is equal on both sides. After a few moves, there's already a difference. The possibilities for the one to win are greater than for the others. But still, the one whose moves have been less good than the opponents has still a chance to win. From there on, there is a process in which at one point there is no more freedom for one to win and no more chance for the other to lose. The difference is only that the good chess player knows when he has lost the game a few moves ahead of losing his king. The poor chess player goes to the end and he has to see how his king disappears, and then he's convinced he has lost. Now, if you take the move in the chess play between the first move and that move in which the good chess player knows the game is lost, you see a development of decreasing capacity, decreasing freedom, of decreasing possibility of choice, from the moment where there is full freedom to the moment where there is no more choice. Let me mention an example from a rather unknown book, the Old Testament, where when the Old Testament tells about the story of the liberation of the Hebrews from Egypt, it is said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, I don't think that means that God wanted Pharaoh to get harder and harder, but it simply means in the process of doing evil, any person's heart hardens. There is a point where we could still decide. After a while, we can decide no more, because our heart has hardened enough by our actions. And again, this is an example for the process of either gaining or losing freedom in the development of one's whole personality. I think we are in the same position today. I believe we have still time to choose life and peace, but certainly the margin of our freedom has narrowed down considerably, and it may not be many years from now that there is no more choice and no more freedom in this. The second point I wanted to make is a question of predictability. Those who speak of determinism in history often mean that a certain outcome is predetermined, there is no other way, hence there is also no freedom. This is often presented, especially by the Soviet so-called Marxist, as Marxist theory of history, which is in fact a misrepresentation. I think the problem of freedom and of determination and determinism in history is not that we can assume there is one cause which will by necessity produce a certain outcome, but that we should rather say what is determined are alternatives, that both in individual life and in historical life of the human race, of a society, what is determined are certain ascertainable alternatives which are limited in scope, In other words, it is not just one outcome which is determined, but there's also not an unlimited choice of events which can happen, but there are various ascertainable alternatives, two or three, or sometimes maybe four, and also these alternatives have their conditions which are ascertainable, and in fact it is the task of the science of man or of the science of society to investigate which are the conditions which lead to various alternatives, and hence also which are the conditions which could lead to choosing the one as against the other. A third problem referring to choice and freedom is one which is very much discussed in the last 30, 40 years of Western history, and that is getting stuck in the choice between two evils. Usually people see an alternative between the bigger evil and the smaller evil. They think all they can do is to choose between the two evils, and logically think if they choose the lesser evil, that's better than to choose the bigger evil. What happens in individual and in political life is usually that this only means to postpone the arrival of the bigger evil for a while, but it arrives with all the more certainty. In order to make the point clearer, I should like to tell you a North American Indian legend which deals with the question how the Grand Canyon was created. The story is briefly of a young man who had the outrageous and criminal idea of not marrying within his own tribe, but to marry a girl from another tribe. His elder thought he was either crazy or criminal, so did the elders of a tribe where he saw a girl with whom he fell in love, and she fell in love with him. So they decided to kill him, and he declared he would come back to marry her. The girl, when she heard that, sent messengers to tell him he shouldn't return, but of course he did. But he was clever enough to ask the messengers, at what point precisely do they want to kill me? And they told him. So when he came, a minute before the point when they were going to kill him, he took the girl, put her on his horse, and they rode off. But after a while they saw that the men from the village pursued them. They had fresh horses, there were many, they got closer and closer. And at this point the girl said to the boy, look here, if we go on riding, this will lead only to death. Because the more we ride, the further we ride, the closer they come. There's no sense in continuing what we are doing. Let us do something else. The boy said, more intelligently than most men, let us say, act, all right, what can we do? And she said, let us get down from our horses and pray to the gods. And the boy said, again astonishingly, let's do that. And they got down from their horses, they prayed to the gods. There was a big storm and darkness, and when the storm and the darkness disappeared, the Grand Canyon was between them and their pursuers. Well, this is a very poetic legend of humanism, but I'm not mentioning it for this reason primarily, but for another reason. The girl refused to accept doing something which definitely did not make sense and which would only postpone the final catastrophe. And she has the imagination to see that if something does not lead to anywhere except destruction, it doesn't make sense to continue it. And it is still more realistic and more rational to say, let us see whether there is not another possibility. This other possibility in this case is to pray to the gods. Now, we pride ourselves of praying to God all the time, but I think we have very little confidence that this has any use in comparison with our realism of continuing the arms race. We go on with the arms race in a kind of naive optimism, thinking maybe in this way eventually we can avoid war. What I mean to say is that one of the great dangers in making choices is to be stuck in cliché alternatives, in continuing actions or direction which cannot lead to anything but destruction, and not to see that there may always be another possibility. And this possibility is the possibility which in this legend is expressed as prayer to the God, the possibility of humanity, the possibility of the voice of truth, the possibility, if you please, of Christian behavior. Eventually, I want to mention a fourth point concerning the question of choice and freedom, and that is the strange thing which happens in human life so often. In individual life, you can observe it every day with yourself or with your friends, but also in political life and in historical life. And that is that man's greatest mistake in living seems to be our inability to know when we make a crucial choice, our inability to know when we are at the crossroads. We all know that man has fantastic emergency powers of energy, skill, imagination, when he is confronted with a clear awareness that here is the matter of to be or not to be, a matter of life and death. People have shown, and we can observe it, remarkable and remarkable gifts which nobody would have thought of imagination and energy once they recognized it was a matter of life and death. We see that with every one of us in a critical situation, driving a car, that we do things which we usually couldn't do. But if you think of thousands and hundreds of thousands of refugees who, having lost their money, being driven from their home, have done the most remarkable things, have shown the most remarkable energy and imaginativeness, we see not only that we usually live far below our potential of energy and imaginativeness and skill, but also that we can mobilize it once we see the clear choice. Now, what leads most of us into a situation or to the failure in our lives, is that when it is not a clear-cut situation of life and death, we see decisions in a fractionated way. We see only a little step here, a little step here, a little step here, and when we recognize that the first step led in this direction, it is already too late. Our heart is already hardened. We have already lost the chess game. One of the greatest questions in individual and political life is to acquire the ability to see that one little step may be the beginning of a course of action which eventually will not be reversible anymore, and to recognize when such a step is made. In case we do that, then I believe a person would be able to develop those very emergency powers I have spoken of, and be able to really change his course of life. He then has still the freedom of action, still the energy and skill to go a different way. But what we do with ourselves, and what usually the leaders of a society do with their people, is to be encouraging by actually making them believe that things are all right, that everything goes well, and hence to prevent them to mobilize that emergency energy which we have for the purpose of changing our life or changing the fate of society. I believe that our choice today is a choice which we can still make, although we have lost a great deal of our initiative. Namely, that is the choice of a new humanism or barbarism. Barbarism, unless it were the destruction of the whole human race and of all life. But while I'm not as optimistic as Mr. Kahn that atomic war will only destroy 60 million lives and afterwards life will go on as before, It seems that today, with the present weapons of destruction, there is still a possibility that only 120 billion Americans will be killed, only the similar amount of Russians, and a corresponding amount of neutrals. But I think what is certain is that atomic war would mean the end of our civilization. It would mean a barbaric dictatorship, regardless of whether it is led by Moscow or led by Washington. It will mean the end of all the values for which we say we are willing to fight an atomic or nuclear war. I want now to speak about humanism as the one choice. I don't want to speak about barbarism because it's left to anybody's imagination what barbarism would mean, what the international armed police state would mean. But we can say something about humanism because we have a tradition of a few thousand years in which these ideas have been developed. Let me first say a few words about the tradition of humanism in the Western world. The same tradition exists in the Eastern world too. First, a few words about the Old Testament. The Old Testament starts with the creation of one man, and as a Talmudic source says, this means that no man can ever claim that he is superior to any other man because his ancestors were superior. And secondly, it means that anyone who destroys one life is as if he had destroyed the whole human race. And anyone who saves one life is as if he had saved the whole human race. Also it means, and that is Old Testament thinking, that man is created in the likeness of God. And hence that all men share in the same basic human quality. I want to mention another Old Testament concept which is usually ignored, and that is the Old Testament concept of loving the stranger. You see, loving the neighbor is something which we all do more or less, not too much actually, but still. The neighbor meaning the one with whom we are familiar, who belongs to the same clan, who has eaten the same food as a child, who has sung the same songs, who speaks the same language, who has the same bad or good habits. The stranger is the one who is not familiar. He is what the Greeks call the barbarian, the one outside of our own tribal stable, if I could call it that way, in which we feel warm and protected. And the idea of humanism begins with the capacity of loving the stranger. That is to say, loving the one with whom we are not familiar because he is as human as we are and he is basically not different in his humanity. And eventually you find the most radical and clear expression of humanism in the Old Testament in the prophetic version of the Messianic time. The time when man will have found a new union with his fellow man, with nature, and in which there will be no favorite nation, neither Israel nor the Assyrians or the Egyptians, as the prophet expresses it very clearly. Now you see the same humanist tradition continued in Christianity. The command, love thy enemy, is pretty much the same as a command, love the stranger. In fact, if I can love the stranger, there is no more enemy, because the enemy is not different from myself. I shall come back to this in a few minutes. The whole concept of the humanity of Christ has been, especially in the late Middle Ages, and I mentioned a thinker, great Catholic thinker like Nicholas of Cusa, here defined or described as being the bond of the world and the highest proof of its inner unity. It is the humanity of Christ which guarantees and proves that man is one, and that all men share in the same humanity. We have, on the other hand, Greek and Roman sources for the idea of humanism. Let me just read a statement by Cicero. We must now conceive of this whole universe as one commonwealth of which both God and men are members. This is not a United Nations or a League of Nations. This is the commonwealth of men who share this commonwealth with the gods, and whose highest loyalty is to mankind and not to the nation state. I can't give here in these few minutes a history of humanistic thought. I just want to mention how the tradition goes from Hebrew, Greek, Roman sources to the Middle Ages, then to the Renaissance, and how humanism finds its highest development, I would say, in the 18th century. Here, the French and especially the Germans, Herder, Lessing, Goethe, conceive of a new idea of humanism, and maybe Goethe has carried it to its highest, to its crowning point, the idea that each man carries in himself not only his individuality, but all of humanity with its potentialities. Mankind is within every one of us, and all human potentialities are within us. This is not the humanism as it is talked of today very often, namely humanism as a kind of philosophy which primarily is anti-religious. Or it is not the humanism of the Renaissance, namely the interest in the learning of antiquity. This is a concept of humanism which is more profound and more deep, namely the assumption that we are human in as much as we all share the same substance, in as much as we all have the same essence. I don't have the time to discuss here another writer which carries on the spirit of Enlightenment humanism, and that is Marx. If you are interested in Marx humanism, and if you want to understand the reality of Marx humanism in contrast to what the Soviet communists say and to what the American press says, I would recommend the anthology on Marx by Professor Feuer, which probably most of you know, and I would additionally recommend a little book which I published recently, Marx's Concept of Man. It's in a paperback, and not so much my own introduction, but the first English publication of Marx's philosophical writings, and if you don't know, it is by Marx. You probably will not believe it would be if you have read what is said about Marx in general in the American press and by most Sovietologists or demologists, or whatever the word is, demonologists. You can say essentially that Marx humanism, or what characterizes Marx in comparison with the whole humanistic tradition from Spinoza to Goethe, is one thing, namely that in his philosophical writings he has given expression to humanist experience and humanist concepts in many ways richer and more penetrating than even Goethe or Herder or Lessing, and secondly, that he has connected the humanist idea with an analysis of economics and of society, and his whole concept of socialism, to put it very briefly, was how is humanism possible in an industrial society? Or to put it differently, how is an industrial society possible in a spirit of humanism as against a spirit of alienated bureaucracy or bureaucratism? Now, Marx actually is already a reaction to the decay of humanism which happened beginning with the French Revolution. This is one of the tragic facts of history, that the French Revolution, which was based upon the ideas of humanism of the 18th century philosophers, was the beginning of a reverse process, namely of the worship of the nation state, which begins with the French Revolution, which finds its first gruesome expression in the First World War, in the Second World War, and eventually in the Cold War, in which is a preparation, at least most likely a preparation for the Third World War, for nuclear war, which indeed would surpass anything in brutality and destruction which the first two world wars have shown. In the 19th century has replaced the humanism of the 18th century by a new form of idolatry, by the worship of the new idol, the national state, in which nationalism was combined with the economic interests of the Industrial Revolution in each country, resulting in a phenomenon which one might call imperialism, the national state out to increase its own power, its own economic power in various ways of domination of foreign peoples and foreign countries, or exploitation of foreign countries. Indeed, we often believe that the 19th century is a very progressive century because we consider nationalism progressive. Especially today, when African and Asian nations want their political liberation, there are many people who think that this is the most progressive and most wonderful thing in the world that has ever happened to mankind. They are still living in the 19th century concept of nationalism. Now, it's perfectly true that nations who have been oppressed by another nation should be free from this oppression. But if they end up in the same nationalism which has led us into the mess we are in right now, this is not precisely the hope for mankind. The hope for mankind is not the increase of many national states. The hope for mankind is a new humanism, a new, if you please, cosmopolitanism, in which man becomes again a member of a commonwealth of man, and in which he feels that his primary loyalty belongs to the human race and not to an idol called the nation state. This idol, the nation state, in the 19th century and today, is indeed an idolatry which is not different from the idolatry about which the prophets of the Old Testament talked. Namely, idolatry in which right and wrong is not conditioned by a moral judgment, not conditioned by one's reason, in which judgment is not even conditioned by reason and a sense of reality, but whether it serves the Moloch or whether it doesn't serve the Moloch. I intend to use the word Moloch as one of those frightful idols which the Bible describes in their description of the life of the people in Canaan or in Palestine. Of course, we think that the Moloch of the nation state is not an idol. We think that Caesar and God have the same interests, and we are not even aware that there is a difference between Caesar and God, and by Caesar I mean precisely here the nation state which conditions forms our value judgment and falsifies our conscience. In this process, which has gone on in the 19th century, there is also another element which is very important to see, and that element is the increasing brutalization of man. The brutalization began in the First World War, when millions of people died for no purpose, died for an illusion that they were fighting for freedom. The Germans were convinced they were fighting for freedom because they were fighting the Tsar, and the soldiers of the Western powers were convinced they were fighting for freedom because they were fighting for the Kaiser, or rather against the Kaiser. Well, it's just a toss-up whether the Tsar or the Kaiser were worse enemy of freedom. In fact, it was an illusion, and when the chips were down, the victors divided their spoils as they had agreed secretly before, and if the Germans had won, they would have done exactly the same. And the victors betrayed the promise they had made, and Wilson's 14 points of no conquest and no reparations were conveniently forgotten. So millions of people died actually for nothing, for an illusion of fighting for freedom, for human ideal, which turned out not to be the main point of the war at all. Of course, once nations are engaged in the war, they believe they fight for their existence, and it is very easy for their leaders if they want to prolong the war, because they want to have the spoils they expected, to convince each nation, if we stop fighting, we shall be destroyed. While it would be the task of leaders who have concern with their peoples to find a way to stop the fighting, when actually nobody has a particular interest in destroying the other. That held true for the First World War. Then the process of brutalization led to the brutalization of the Stalin regime, the Hitler regime, to some extent the Mussolini regime, to the Second World War with its unprecedented killing, first by the Germans of English cities, then by the Western Allies of 80, 100,000 men, women and children in one night, in a few hours, in Germany and Japan. And now we are in the midst of the Cold War, and I mentioned this before, in which it is coldly considered that, as Mr. Kahn writes, the death of 60 million Americans is acceptable. Acceptable to whom? We don't know. We are not told to whom it is acceptable. And why, if 60 millions are acceptable, are not 100 millions acceptable? This kind of thinking would actually have been probably impossible 60 years ago, or even 40 years ago, of coldly talking about the rationality of such mass destruction as being acceptable and as being something required to carry out the task of spreading humanism, freedom and idealism and the belief in God in the world, somehow mixed with free enterprise. I think you people who are born 20 years ago or so have really no full appreciation of the process of brutalization which has happened in these 40 years. You are already born in the midst of it, at the peak of it. I might remind you of the fact that half a century ago, the false accusation of a rather unsympathetic Jewish captain in France, Captain Dreyfus, aroused world opinion when he was sentenced, although he was not guilty. Today, such a case wouldn't interest anybody, because what is there to one human life when we are now talking about the destruction of millions of human lives? And the dangerous logic is that each one thinks, I have to be inhuman because the others are inhuman. And so they are mutually reinforcing their own brutality. And so brutality and inhumanity appear rational. And both are reasoning in the same and dangerous way. Now, there is another form of inhumanity which has developed recently in the systems both of the West and, I believe, in the system of the Soviet Union. We have a new way of producing. The big enterprise, the managerial bureaucracy, the consumption-hungry organization man who is mostly interested in producing things and who has transformed himself into a thing. He is deeply bored, but he represses this boredom. This is in fact the most outstanding example of repression. Never mind the Oedipus complex, your incestuous striving so that your grandmother has spanked you when you were 3 years old. That's nothing. But watch the unconscious boredom, maybe less on this campus than in some other parts of our world, but what efforts everybody makes not to be aware that he is bored, and how a large part of our industry delivers the goods which permit us precisely to repress the fact that we are bored. We are actually bored in a sense which, clinically speaking, is not too different from a slight chronic depression. You know what a depressed person is. A depressed person is not a person who is sad. He would be happy if he could be sad. The depressed person is a person who feels nothing. And you will find in many depressed persons that one way out of their depression is either, if they have the money, of going on a buying spree or overeating. The overeating needs less money in general. You can do it with much cheaper, and therefore more people can do that. Now, what is really the buying or eating? It is, in some strange way, an attempt to get over one's inner sense of emptiness, one's inner sense of depressiveness, because in some way introducing something in our system is felt as if we wouldn't have to faint. And by faint I mean now not physically but emotionally, as if we had some strength. Now, an older way of overcoming this is the sense of property. But today, really, we don't have much property. We have enough money to use, to buy things. The new man is the consumer, the organization man, the faceless, alibiing, buck-passing organization man, who feels his identity by being as similar as possible to everyone else, never being 3 feet away from the herd, but who, like in a post-hypnotic experiment, is convinced that his ideas and feelings are all his own, and not being aware that they are all the same, all tailor-made, and that they have them all from the same sources. Even the magazines now become so similar that the Saturday Evening Post looks like a very modern and recent magazine. So you don't even see the difference anymore between the people who read the Saturday Evening Post and some more modern magazines. Now, what I want to stress is that this new man has become inhuman in a very peculiar sense. The traditional problem of good and evil is a problem which is, I would say, within the limits of humanity. To be good is human and to be evil is human. But there is now a new concept of inhumanity which truly goes beyond good and evil. And that is a concept of the new organization man who feels himself to be a thing, who has transformed into a thing, who is a bureaucrat, who administers people and things and deals with people as he deals with things, as numbers. And this new organization man, the bureaucrat, the big one and the small one, they are truly inhuman, not because they are cruel, but because they are things rather than men. Their problem is not good and evil. Their problem is something which goes beyond it, because it is a problem of things which cannot do evil or feel evil nor good. I really believe the new symbol, the symbol of this new humanity, is a man like Eichmann. Eichmann, I believe, is a man who was not cruel particularly, nor was he good. He was a bureaucrat. It did not make any difference to him whether he shipped coal or Jews, or whether he would ship the Jews for being killed or for being exported somewhere. What mattered to him was, as for every bureaucrat, that the machine functions well. Never mind good and evil. In fact, it is indecent to think of good and evil, because once you think of that, your machine might not function so smoothly. You might be distracted by some such human considerations. The proper functioning of the machine is the only aim of the bureaucrat. And while from the standpoint of the machine this is efficient, from a human standpoint it is the end of humanity. And I should like here to come back to the concept of humanism in its psychological meaning. I spoke before about the history of the idea, or rather I made some very brief indications about the course of this history. But I should like now to speak of the concept of humanity not as of a philosophical concept, but as of an inner experience. Humanism as an experience, rather than as a philosophical idea simply, means that I experience in myself all that is human, or to speak with Terence, that nothing human is alien to me. And that means that I experience in myself the criminal and the saint, the child and the adult, the man who lived 100,000 years ago and the man who will live, if we don't destroy each other, 100,000 years from now. That all this is in myself, and hence that I can understand another person. I can understand another person only if I can experience the other person in myself. Otherwise, I talk about a person as I talk about rats. Now, that is a perfectly legitimate scientific aim, but it is not understanding another person. What I understand is only that which is in me. Now, this has a relationship to the concept of the unconscious, about which I want to say a few words. To be in touch with our unconscious really means to be in touch with our full humanity. I was saying before, never mind the things which are so much talked about as far as the unconscious is concerned. What we really do when or let me put it this way, what is our consciousness? Our consciousness is only that part of our human experience which the given society in which we live permits to be filtered through to our awareness, through its language, its logic, and the various taboos of feelings. Because the main fear of man is to be isolated, to be separated, to be an outcast. Hence we are afraid of feeling anything which would separate us from the rest of mankind. If in a small tribe of warriors who live from warfare and killing and robbing, a man would feel that he doesn't like it, he would probably not be aware of his not liking it. He would only be aware that he has a psychosomatic symptom, maybe a psychogenic vomiting in the morning when they go on the warpath. Our consciousness is a reflection of that part of human existence which is developed in the society in which we live. Our unconscious is a universal man. It is all that is human. It is the good and the bad, the rational and the irrational. And hence, to be truly in contact with our unconscious means to be in contact with all humanity within ourselves, and that means to be in contact with a stranger, because then there is no more stranger. The stranger is different only as far the consciousness is concerned, as far that sector is concerned which his society represents. As far the universal man is concerned, he is the same as we are. And indeed, I believe, if we want to overcome the tribalism and the nationalism, which is more threatening today than it ever was before, then we have to get in touch with the humanity within ourselves, and we have to criticize any given social and political organization from the standpoint of the true interests of man, and we have to react from the standpoint of this humanistic experience. I said that we are confronted with a choice, and I believe the choice is indeed the choice between humanism and barbarism. It is the choice which is the most basic choice in the last analysis, that between, as the Bible says, life and death, blessing and curse. We still have a short breathing spell. If we miss this last possibility to choose humanism, then indeed our end will be barbarism at best, and full destruction at worst, and full brutalization in any case. And I should like to end with reminding you of something Emerson said when he very prophetically said, "Things are in the saddle and ride mankind." Indeed, today things are in the saddle much more than they were in his time, and the thing that is in the saddle today is the nuclear weapons and the bureaucracy which administer it. I believe our choice is indeed either this barbarism of which I spoke or to put man back into the saddle. Thank you.